of a New York Times article and how they report the findings of a peer-reviewed research study on Australian cannibalistic toads. So this section is going to be about what the New York Times reports. So the New York Times essentially summarizes that there are these cane farmers. These cane farmers introduce these toads to stop cane beetles from eating their crop. So these toads are not native to Australia. What the researchers found was that over time, as there were not a lot of cane beetles left for the toads to eat, they developed an adaptation where they would consume their own young. They would consume their own hatching cane toad eggs. And so the researchers wondered why. Well, the New York Times reports from the article that the researchers found that when a certain toxin was present in the water, it would trigger the toads to want to go eat their own hatchlings. So they would sense this toxin in the water, they would go to where that toxin is, then they would consume whatever has that toxin, and that species, the species that tended to have that toxin, was their own young, because this toxin was uh, exclusive for the most part to this toad species. And so they also found that when the hatching process would begin, so when the eggs break and this toxin's released into the water, the toads would consume at a far higher rate. Um, they would consume them at a far higher rate than at other times. So the conclusions that they found were that because of the density of the toad population in Australia, cannibalism evolved because they ran out of things to eat. And they also believe that the toads are not done evolving. So that's what the New York Times article says. Now let's take a look at what this research study actually says. And we're going to go through a couple of different things. The first is essentially this part says, hey, there are these toad larvae that are specifically in this one area and they are eating their own young. However, in other areas where this species is present, they are not eating their own young. And then they go on to say that they found that a certain toxin stimulates the frogs into a feeding behavior, and then it would increase predation on their own young, on their own eggs. And they also found that it wouldn't just increase predation on their own young, on their own eggs, but it would also increase predation on other inert species in that environment that would otherwise not be consumed. And so what they concluded was that there was a cost benefit to this cannibalistic nature. The cost is that the species is more vulnerable in early life stages, but the benefit is that there is reduced vulnerability to other species because they are being consumed so much by their own species. And so there's one key thing we need to look at here. We have this graph. This is a key piece of information that needs to be analyzed. This graph essentially states the time in hours at which these young are being produced, and then they are hatching, and then they're going out and swimming around and growing to become toads. And so there's a specific piece of this graph that we need to look at it. And this specific piece is right here. I have it highlighted in yellow on the left side. What we're seeing is that between 20 and 60 hours, when the toxin is present, there are far higher levels of cannibalism at a certain point of egg justification. So we see right here, the point in the dark gray part on the left is where these hatchlings are still in the egg, and then we have the point where they are now hatchlings, and we see right as they are between 20 and 40 hours, right as they are hatching, the species they are far more likely to be consumed by the toads. And so how accurate is this? Well, there are a couple of things that we need to look at. I would say that the New York Times article is largely accurate because it does three primary things. They first provide background information on how the frog was introduced into Australia, and that's accurate to what the research study says. They then go on to provide context to how the situation evolved into its current status, and then they continue to identify the specific toxin that does increase cannibalism among these toads. However, this is all done in a summarized manner, and so there are some things that are kind of left out. there are some faults that need to be highlighted with this article that are left out. So, what are these faults? Well, there are three primary ones. The article does not specify that the hatchlings being consumed are usually distant relatives of the consumer. So these frogs are not they're not producing their own young and then eating them right away. That's not what happens. They're not eating close relatives. The second thing is that the article does not specify that there is an ideal consumption period when the cannibalism is most likely to occur. That's what we saw with the graph. And that was between 20 and 60 hours. And then the article also does not mention the cost benefit analysis of the cannibalism in this environment. So, all things considered, this is a largely accurate article. What they state is what was said in the study, they just left out some key things.